Well, Budget 2025 was supposed to mark what we were told was going to be a generational shift in this country. That's what we were told. And when it came to housing, the government promised something truly historic. In fact, the budget documents declared, rather boldly I might add, that Budget 2025 is the most ambitious housing plan since the Second World War, backed by more than $11 billion in a brand new top-down federal initiative called Build Canada Homes. That's a pretty big claim, Mr. Speaker, and when a government promises to match the scale of what Canada achieved in the Second World War, well, I think it's probably worth embracing and remembering just how extraordinary that moment was in Canadian history. Back then, Canada wasn't just short on housing, we were in a full-blown emergencies. 10 years of economic depression, followed by 6 years of war, had nearly wiped out home building in Canada. When peace finally came, over 1 million veterans returned in a matter of months. They were getting married, starting families, looking for work, looking to start their futures. But Canada simply didn't have any homes. We know this from the debates in this very House. On August the 12th, 1944, then Finance Minister James Lorimer Ilsley warned Parliament that housing had become one of the gravest domestic problems facing the nation. He described overcrowding, rising rents, and the shortage of adequate dwellings in every major centre. And he was not exaggerating. According to the government's own 1946 report on housing and community planning, Canada was short more than 200,000 homes. Cities were reporting families living in garages, converted barracks, temporary wartime huts. Wartime Housing, which was a temporary agency during the war, had to expand its operations because so many Canadians simply had nowhere else to go. But here's the critical lesson from that era, Mr. Speaker. Canada solved that crisis. We solved it with focus, with urgency, and with a government that understood its job was not to control everything, but to clear the way for builders and for communities, for families. When the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation was created in 1946, its mandate was clear: accelerate construction, cut through bureaucracy, and partner with the private sector to rebuild the country. And it worked. Between 1947 and 1955, Canada built more homes per capita than at any other time in our history. Entire communities were built from the ground up in neighborhoods in Toronto and Ottawa, Calgary, Vancouver, and Halifax. They all flourished. Builders built. Trades worked. Families prospered. And government? Well, government kept costs low and approvals fast. It stayed in its lane. It empowered Canadians instead of layering on more red tape. That was the formula. That is the lesson. Mr. Speaker, the contrast with today's reality simply couldn't be sharper. Young Canadians now face a housing crisis that by many measures is even worse than what we faced in 1945. The Bank of Canada and Statistics Canada tell us that housing is more unaffordable relative to income than at any other time in our history. Government-imposed costs, development charges, fees, taxes, regulatory delays, they equal between 30 and 50% of the price of a new home in major cities in this country. The C.D. Howe Institute and the Canadian Home Builders Association have all been telling us this. The CMHC, the very agency created to cut red tape back then, now warns that red tape is one of the biggest barriers to building homes that Canadians need. Their 2023 housing supply report confirms that Canada builds fewer homes per capita today than we did in the 1970s, despite the fastest population growth in more than half a century. Mr. Speaker, this isn't because Canadians have somehow forgotten to build. We have some of the best builders in the world and tradespeople. It's not because we lack the land or the lumber or the talent. This is a crisis created by government. Layer after layer of fees, years-long approvals timelines, endless paperwork, a system so slow and so expensive that viable projects become unaffordable before a shovel even hits the ground. And instead of cutting through the barriers, this government keeps building new bureaucracies, including a fourth federal housing body, and then they call it ambition. Budget 2025 was supposed to break this cycle, but instead of addressing the real structural problems, it simply repeated the approach that has been failing Canadians for almost a decade. The Prime Minister promised to cut development charges in half, for example. In Budget 2025, there's nothing about that. He promised to incentivize private rental construction through the old MERB program. Budget 2025 says nothing about that either. He promised a generational shift. But we know the first 6 projects announced under the Build Canada Homes announcement are all Canada Lands Company projects that they have been working on for years. And while this government claims to be fighting the gatekeepers, they continue to reward the worst offenders. Let's look at Toronto. After charging massive development fees, including a 40% increase just after receiving approval for their $471 million Housing Accelerator Fund, a deal they're not even honoring today, the federal government still handed them $283 million for a sewer project they had already charged developers for. Mr. Speaker, this government is rewarding failure. They are rewarding the worst housing gatekeepers in the country. Meanwhile, the scale of the crisis continues to grow. The CMHC tells us that Canada needs 480,000 homes a year for the next 10 years to restore affordability. This year, we have not yet reached 200,000 starts. In fact, 2025 is on track to be the worst year for home building in 3 decades. Young Canadians are doing everything right. They are working hard. They're saving what they can, but they still can't afford a home. They're delaying families. They're delaying their careers. They're delaying life itself because they cannot find or afford a place to live. This is not the Canada that we want to leave them. And it doesn't have to be this way. The post-war generation showed us exactly what works when we take the housing crisis seriously. They kept costs down. They reduced government barriers. They aligned federal, provincial, and municipal efforts. They partnered with builders instead of fighting them. And they measured success by one outcome: getting homes built. This is the approach that Conservatives would bring back. We would lower the cost and burden of government because every delay and every dollar added by government adds up on the price of a home. We would eliminate duplication, streamline approvals, and bring common sense timelines to projects. We would reward municipalities that open doors and stop giving money to those that slam them shut. We would treat housing as a national priority, not just as a slogan, but as a mission grounded in results. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are practical. They're builders, they're problem solvers, and our history proves it. After the war, we didn't back away from the scale of the challenge. We met it head on. And in the process, we built a future that gave families hope and stability and prosperity. Budget 2025 fails all those Canadians who believed the Prime Minister when he promised to build at a scale not seen in generations. We can do it again. The example is in our own history. Young Canadians deserve a government that works as hard as they do, one that cuts red tape instead of adding it, a government that empowers builders instead of blocking them, a government that rewards cities that are getting the job, not the ones that aren't doing the job, one that focuses on what matters, getting more homes built so every Canadian has a safe place to live. Canada has beaten the housing crisis before, but Budget 2025 does not even come close to the ambition required for the scale of the problem today. I would actually encourage the Finance Minister to look back in our history to the work of another era, a time when Canada recognized the scale of the crisis in housing and took bold action to meet the challenge head on. I would encourage the Minister of Housing to understand the scale of the crisis today and that it does call for bold, sweeping action. I wish he understood that his proposals that tinker around the edges of the real root cause of the problem, the housing crisis, and waiting to see if that works, that time is over. I wish he understood that without bold action, today's housing crisis is quickly becoming a housing catastrophe. Budget 2025 does not meet the moment. It fails an entire generation of young Canadians who dream of achieving what their parents and their grandparents simply took for granted. We have done it before. We can do it again. Mr. Speaker, we must do it again. Thank you.